In the world of art, there's a special kind of art that can only come to life through a second round of creativity. Take music for example, it's a classic case. So, what's the first step in creating music? Well, it all starts with the composer. They jot down their musical masterpieces on sheets, which marks the first round of creation. But here's the thing, music isn't really music until someone sings it or plays the instruments. Without the singing and playing, it's just some scribbles on paper. To make those notes come alive, it's gotta go through the singing and playing process. This kind of art is called secondary creation. Now, think about theater. A play needs a script, right? But having a script is just the first part. It also needs actors to bring it to life on stage. And here's where the director steps in. They're the main player in this whole second-round creation business. That's why we consider directing to be a special category of art too. So, this whole secondary creation thing covers music performances, singing, and literary recitations, like reciting poems, reading prose, and even narrating novels. Back in the day, we used to have a cool tradition, though it's kinda rare now with all the TV and stuff. See, before TV, we used to listen to radio programs. And there was a show that we all loved. You know the one? It was the Steel Meets Fire novel recitation, a long story broken down into half-hour episodes. Steel Meets Fire was a big old novel, but we got to hear the whole thing in just a few episodes. And we used to listen to poetry being recited too, another example of this secondary creation thing, or the art of speech. Then there's another whole category of this kind of stuff. It's all about performances on stage and screen, like movies, dance dramas, stage plays, and operas. A full-on dance drama starts with a script, and then the dancers bring it to life with their moves. And you know movies have scripts too, right? Under the direction of a film director, that script finally jumps onto the big screen. So, all of these are part of this whole secondary creation thing, art that can only exist through performing, or in other words, the art of performance is all about that secondary creation. So, you know this whole idea of secondary creation? It's always been a big puzzle. I remember giving a talk at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, and guess what the title was? Deep Thoughts About Music Performance. I was definitely walking on eggshells, you know? I mean, all the folks there were real music hotshots, violinists, pianists, conductors, all knee-deep in music performance. But well, turns out there's some deep philosophical stuff in that too. So, what's the deal with this philosophical business? Well, my talk was all about the connection between secondary and primary creation. It's a real interesting topic, and it's something that performing artists can't stop chewing over. Let's take sheet music, for example. The same piano piece is played by two different piano whizzes. How do we figure out which performance is better? Let's say Kempf played it, and then Rachmaninoff gave it a go too. It's the same piano piece. How do we decide whose performance was tops? Their performances definitely vary in quality, right? So, where's the yardstick? It's a real head-scratcher. So, our first idea might be that a flawless performance is the best, right? This leads to the idea of the one right performance. What's that all about? It means a performance that sticks totally to the sheet music. Can such a thing even exist? That's the heart of the whole problem. For example, we've brought Dream of the Red Chamber, Dream, to the screen several times, right? Here I will neglect the opera Dream of the Red Chamber, which is really a part of the opera art. We have the original version in the 1980s. Then later we have a remake of Dream. So, let's evaluate the two versions. Of course, the new version of the TV series Dream is not as well received. Why is the rating lower? You have to admit that the new version of Dream is more faithful to the original than the old version, right? What was the pleasure when I watched the new version of Dream? It helped me recall the lines from the book, basically actors speaking them in their original form. That's what Lin Dayu said at the time. It's like this in the book, isn't it? What was my biggest feeling after watching the new version of Dream? There's almost no difference in the 12 ladies of Jinling, the only difference can be made from the lines they recite. The choice of actors, their expressions, eyes, and demeanor are all similar, stereotyped beautiful women. Pinger could be Yuan Yang, or it seems that Pinger is not much different from Bao Chai either. They all have pretty looks, so this was how the work has been adapted to the screen. The biggest advantage of the new version of Dream of the Red Chamber is that it allows us to recall the original work, which is meaningless. So this director must have made a mistake. He thought that bringing Dream onto the screen was faithful to the literary script, and then turning it into an image on the screen. This is not the case with Second Creation. Is there any creativity in the second creation? That's the crux of the matter. If there's no creativity, then it doesn't deserve to be called a second creation. People often think that all forms of performing arts are just replicas of the original text. We strive to faithfully replicate the original text, and creativity takes a back seat. But, here's where we've got it wrong. Let's talk about this interesting English word, pretext. Have you guys heard of it? It's got a couple of meanings. According to the dictionary, it can mean a script, or an excuse. What I find fascinating is that when a film director holds a screenplay, what's the dynamic between the screenwriter and the director? The screenwriter does his bit, and then the director takes over, right? But the director's job isn't just about obediently bringing the script onto the screen. Instead, what they're really dealing with is a pretext. Pretext isn't just a script, it's an excuse too. So, when Zhang Yimou adapted Red Sorghum to the screen, what was Mo Yan's literary novel to him? Just a pretext. He had to put his own creation into it. So, through reading the script, he formed images and ideas for the film, which comes from the language of the film, not the language of literature. If we liken the language of film to the language of literature, it just turns all movies into stage plays on the screen. That's not what we want, right? But, even now, some directors are still stuck in this concept. The same thing applies to music performance. When I see Beethoven's sheet music for a piano sonata, what do I do with it? I use it as a pretext to express the emotional world I comprehend. There are different types of performances, and the only right concept of performance is illusion. In a concert, you might see a performance where not a single note is wrong, everything is just as it's written on the music sheet. But guess what? It could still be a total flop. Then there's another performance that's a big hit, but it's got quite a few mistakes. You could record it and listen back while following the score. You'll notice the flubs, but it's still a real crowd pleaser. Why? Because through that performance, the piece comes alive for every listener. On the other hand, the first performance, though technically perfect, leaves the audience feeling like the music has no soul. I once heard a piece, not naming the conductor. The Blue Danube is a popular tune, but under his direction, it felt like it dragged on forever and was kind of boring. But hey, he didn't mess up, though. Only a lousy director would just bring the script to the screen without adding any creativity, right? Without that, all performing arts would just be plain copies. Performing arts can't be just that, they've gotta involve some originality. So what does that mean? And where do we draw the line? When we talk about the wide world of art, there are different ways we can group things. One way is to split art into two big groups based on how it's presented. You've got novels, poems, and other literary works that are directly presented to the reader. But what about music? A piece of sheet music isn't the music itself, it's just a way to write it down. If a composer doesn't play the music, they write it out, which is also a kind of art. But until someone actually plays the music, the real artwork isn't there yet. That's why we have a whole category called performing arts. That's the difference between performing arts and other kinds of art. So in the big family of art, things like playing music, reciting poetry, and acting in plays, operas, dance shows, and even movies can all be considered performing arts. So, when we're talking about this stuff, we hit a pretty big issue. Here's the deal: when the original piece exists as words on a page, it's not considered a full-on work of art. Those musical notes and words on the sheet, that's just the text. It's only when someone performs or plays the music that it becomes the real deal. Here's where it gets tricky. When we're out there, listening to music, the real deal is right in front of us, ready to go. But it all starts with the text, so there's this connection between the words and the actual performance. Now, this is a deep question, because it's all about how we think about creating art. If we're not getting into the art philosophy stuff, what's the basic idea here? The work we're talking about is basically just a perfect copy of the text. If we start talking about copying, then the whole idea of doing something new in the performing arts kind of falls apart. Yeah, creation doesn't really exist. What we've got to do is make a faithful copy of the text. Does this mean that everything we do in the performing arts is just about making copies? Like, when it comes to playing music, are we all about chasing after that one perfect performance? Can we even say there's just one perfect way to perform something? This is a big question, especially in the music departments of schools. Like, think about piano, violin, or conducting. They're always talking about this stuff and trying to figure it out in real life. So, last time, we talked about this cool English word, pretext, which means text, but also means an excuse. It's a pretty deep word. Every performer is faced with a text that they didn't create. What do they need to see this text as? It should be seen as a pretext, a script. Yeah, but it's also an excuse. This excuse means that there's no way I can fully bring this text into the performance. It's just not possible. This text is just a pretext, just an excuse. We can't just see Zhang Yimou's film Red Sorghum as a plain copy of Mo Yan's novel on the big screen. As a director, how do you stand out among 1,000 other readers? You're just one person. But then, look at another director bringing Hamlet onto the stage. They've got a level of understanding higher than the average reader, right? It's all about their skill to take on a whole new creation and make it their own. And you know what? When we're reading a novel, we're actually doing some creative work in our heads, but we can't turn that into an actual thing. Imagine when I read Dream of the Red Chamber, I've got my own take on it, and so do you. What I see in the characters might not be the same as what you see. How I see Lin Dayu and her world is all shaped by my own understanding as a reader. So, when we're reading Dream, we're all doing some sort of creative work, but it's not something we can turn into a finished piece. Now, think if I, as a director, was to turn Dream of the Red Chamber into a TV series. It's like the small creative spin each of us readers puts on the story turns into a whole TV show. That's where the big gap between directors and us regular readers stands. We all do this kind of thing, you know, like when you recite a poem, you're basically performing too. I used to think I was a pretty good reciter. I've recited Saying Goodbye to Cambridge Again so many times. And Autumn in the Twanbois Marsh, too. Then, this new teacher showed up in our department, and that's when I realized I wasn't really that great at it. He was a real pro at this stuff. It's the same text, but when I recite it and when he does, it's like two completely different things. He can really bring the words to life. When you listen to me recite, you're basically just reading along with me. This whole thing is actually pretty interesting, you know? It's like a deep, philosophical question. How does a performer who's adding their own spin to the work tackle the original text? You're dealing with a work that's already been created, like the original text. So, how do you approach it? What does it even mean to approach it? The trick is to tap into the original creator's vision that made the work a success in the first place. Remember that idea? If you can't get into that original vision, you can't really add your own twist to it. It's like, what even is that original vision? Can the original author give us a clear explanation of it? Probably not. So, there's this story about Beethoven. They say that right after he finished composing a sonata, a friend dropped by and asked if he had come up with any new pieces lately. Beethoven replied, "I just wrote a new piece." Well, the friend got all excited and asked Beethoven to play it, so he performed the sonata he had just finished. After the performance, the friend was like, "What's the meaning behind this piece?" And how did Beethoven respond? He played it again and then told his friend, "This is what I'm trying to convey. You get it now? No? Then listen to it again." It was totally okay for Beethoven to do that because he couldn't explain the meaning of his work in words, you know. Every piece of work is trying to say something. So if you ask me what my work is trying to convey, I can only play it for you again. Looks like the friend asked the wrong question, because the interpretation of the work is up to the listener. By getting into the vibe of Beethoven's sonata, he knew what he was trying to say. This story reminds us of something important. Don't think of a work as the exact representation of what the creator had in mind.